All right, so are we letting folks in? Great. Welcome, everyone. We are going to get started soon. We're just waiting for some folks to come on and join us. Folks will be joining us from a few different platforms, so wanting to give them a little bit of time to come here today. All right, good morning, good afternoon. We will get started shortly. If you haven't already, please grab some tea, grab some coffee, grab some water, get settled in nicely, and we will get started in just a few. All right. Okay, so it looks like we are having a lot of folks joining us from all different territories and landscapes and waterways all across the globe. And we are so excited that you are here with us, joining us, and we'll get started in 1 minute. Okay. So I think we will have folks that will continue to come on and join us throughout the day or throughout this morning. And I suppose we can get started today. So Suguli Swagwak, Daisee ni Yungyats, Anawal, Niwagi Dalota, Anaya de Aga, Niwago Hujota. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Daisee Francour. I am a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. I am also the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communications at Cultural Survival, and I have the privilege to moderate this session today. Before we get into the session and where I introduce and invite all of the esteemed panelists to discuss this really important topic of methodologies and practical approaches to Indigenous languages, I just want to remind folks of a few housekeeping items to start. So if you are joining us on the swap card platform and you need support language interpretation, there is a direct link in the platform to Zoom with that interpretation. Once you get onto the Zoom platform, on the bottom right, there is a little globe icon that you can click on to find the best interpretation channel for yourself. And I do advise if you are using interpretation to also mute original audio. It might be helpful. As well as some directions in terms of interpretation are also going to be linked in the chat. Great. And so we also will have people joining us from Facebook and YouTube Live, and we are really also excited and grateful that you are joining us today. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment to express my deep gratitude, of course, to all the panelists who are joining us here today, the entire Cultural Survival team, for all of their work behind the scenes to make this happen and to really amplify all of this knowledge here today and make it accessible to each and every one of you. And I also want to express my gratitude to all the interpreters who are supporting us here in this space. So with that, I think we can start off in a good way. Today is panel 3 of day 2 of our Indigenous Language Conference at cultural survival. And the focus today is on reclaiming and strengthening our Indigenous languages beyond our homes, with a focus on methodologies and practical approaches. But before we dive into those discussions, where we're going to hear from all of the expert panelists, I just want to do a quick recap of some of the discussions from yesterday. And I hope many of you joined us for those panels yesterday. And if you didn't, that's okay. Those videos are available on Swapcard and on our Facebook and YouTube channels. And so feel free to go back and watch those really great discussions. But just to highlight some of those conversations, some of the high level points really focused on that our languages are really about our relationships to ourselves, to our community, and to the natural world. And it's the way that we relate to people and to our lands and our environments. And it also lays out the path forwards and how we vision ourselves into the future. We also learned that everything is interdependent, and as Indigenous peoples, we have the right to preserve our languages and just the importance of them, because they're represented in every part of our worldview, in our daily lives, to our cosmologies, to our philosophies, our values, our cultures, our traditions, our ceremonies. And we also shared that there is such a deep need for intercultural education, where Indigenous languages and cultures are respected and valued and honored. We also discussed that Indigenous languages, they are a fundamental element of our sovereignty as Indigenous peoples. We also heard various recommendations on how to keep our languages strong. We also heard the ways that philanthropy can also be used to help heal this work. And just to wrap it up, a few last points was we heard from all of the great panelists yesterday that our languages are incredibly dynamic, and they cannot always be easily translated into English because there is so much complex structure and grammar that's embedded in our language. And we also talked about how the loss of language and traditional knowledge, it affects our understanding of the natural world. And it really interrupts the intimate connection between ourselves and our environments. And lastly, just wanting to, again, really elevate all of the great panelists that we had join us yesterday, and ready to invite all of the fantastic panelists here today. And so with that, just if you give me 1 second, I'm going to share my screen. And we are going to start off and introduce our incredible panelists that are joining us today. 1 second. Okay. So our first of 4 panelists are Tatiana Degai, and she is joining us from the Itelmen Nation. Tatiana is a scholar from the Kamchatka Peninsula on the Pacific coast of Russia. She received her PhD at the University of Arizona in the American Indian Studies program with a minor in linguistics. Tatiana is also an esteemed professor at the University of Victoria and an affiliate assistant professor of the Arctic's Indigenous Studies as well, from the University of Northern Iowa. And Tatiana also shares that she has a strong connection with the Council of Itelmens of Kamchatka, where she is working on language and cultural revitalization, as well as community well-being. We're so happy that you're with us here, Tatiana, and we'll give you in a moment after we introduce all the panelists to also introduce yourselves. Our next panelist, oops, I am having a little, there we go, challenges with technology, if you bear with me. is Richard Grounds. And Richard Grounds comes from the Yuchi and Seminole nations. He is the executive director of the Yuchi Language Project, which was recognized as the outstanding host for 2017 by the Tula Global Alliance. And after Richard completed his PhD in the history of religions at Princeton Theology Seminary, he also taught at the Olaf College in the anthropology department at the University of Tulsa. So again, super grateful that Richard is joining us here, a part of this discussion. Our third panelist is Juan Solano, coming from the Kañari peoples. Juan is the coordinator of the research unit of the Quiolac Bilingual Intercultural Pedagogical Institute. I apologize, you can correct me when you introduce yourself if I mispronounce anything. Juan is also the coordinator of the project titled The Revitalization of the Ancestral Quechua Language and a founding member of the Onitin Cultural Foundation and the Front of Artists and Cultural Managers of the province of Kañari. Juan is also the manager of the first functional interactive game on a spoken platform in his ancestral language. Really grateful that Juan is here joining us today as well. And lastly, our fourth and final panelist is Jennifer Weston, who comes from Lakota Nations. She is the co-director at Lakota Wellbeing Project. Jennifer is a writer, a producer, a nonprofit leader and fundraiser who has worked in this field for the last 25 years in tribal community programs and really specifically focused on environmental justice, Indigenous education, and language revitalization. And she recently directed a language reclamation project from 2012 to 2021 before joining in working in her current role at the Lakota Wellbeing Project. And she also helped manage Cultural Survival's Endangered Language Program from 2008 to 2012. So those are our panelists. I do want to open it up to each and every one of them to also introduce themselves. Certainly, there's so much more to them and their work and their communities, and I really want to invite each one to introduce themselves. So with that, I will invite our first panelist, Tatiana, to introduce yourself. Welcome, Tatiana.
Chin, Guma Tatiana's kitchen, Gavral Alt Golf kitchen. Hello, everybody. I'm calling in today from the traditional territories of Langwangan, the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Saanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. My relationship with this land here in Victoria, British Columbia, are quite young, but I daily celebrate these beautiful grounds and feel much inspiration they bring to my life and my work. My heart is also at home in Kamchatka land, traditional home to Itelmen people. And on your screen, you see a map of North Pacific. Find a peninsula in the shape of salmon. This is Kamchatka land that was created by Kutch the raven out of the king salmon. Kutch the raven infused fire into the mountains and life into the rivers and taught people to hunt and fish. Everything I know today is informed by this land, by the land of my relatives and ancestors. Itelmen language is considered a language isolate, and it is severely endangered today. We have one fluent speaker who was born, raised, and lives with Itelmen. We do have a number of middle-aged knowledge holders who were born with the language but lost it at school. There is a strong will in the community to bring conversations in the language back. Various members of our community and beyond have done tremendous work on keeping our language. Thanks to them, we have dictionaries, textbooks, Itelmen lessons at school and in pedagogical college, and language lessons for adults. While many of us critique such formal approach, I believe that in language revitalization, we need to use all resources possible to keep the language alive. And what my and younger generation have is a starting point to develop more. Indigenous languages in Russia fall under the auspices of the Ministry of Education. Therefore, language revitalization is closely tied and in many instances limited by formal educational establishments, federal educational standards, and classwork. We have heard amazing stories of success yesterday from our brothers and sisters. We in Russia have a long way to go in our part of the world on developing meaningful language revitalization agenda and planning that actually works. While this sounds rather grim, I remain enthusiastic about the well-being of our language. In recent years, a regular group of language learners was formed in the city area. All are adults who took responsibility to relearn Itelmen and teach others of what they know. These are extremely active Itelmens who bring the language in their everyday life and every cultural event happening in the city. We also have rather curious children who are interested and are learning Itelmen in the classroom. While it is formal, this classroom is unique in a way that it is living and breathing Itelmen worldview, since it is located in the last remaining village where Itelmens are a majority. In my work, I'm trying to focus on developing educational materials that support language revitalization both in and outside the classroom. These materials are meant for children, their parents, teachers, and those outside Itelmen community. These are supporting materials that provide informal options to language learning. And today I will briefly share with you two examples of the latest publications. One of them is Games with Kutch the Raven. It is an activity book that tells about salmon through Itelmen language and indigenous knowledge. We developed this activity book with my grandmother, and it starts with a creation story and then goes with little pieces of introductional knowledge into the world of salmon, and also some activities such as word search and introduction to the Itelmen words for some salmon associated terminology. And in the middle, you see the page that introduces the salmon skin clothes, which we started to revive recently. And also along with this, we're reviving the language terminology for that as well. And another example is Go Fish in Itelmen cards. And this, for this, I was inspired by my children who really like to play Go Fish. And I thought that would be a great idea to do it in Itelmen. So these materials were developed with the hope that language learners can practice their language in informal setting. For example, sitting by the fire and playing cards in Itelmen. This introduced flora and fauna of Kamchatka and of our land, and they also introduced on this white paper, it has instructions in Itelmen of which words and phrases to use when you win, when you lose, when you want to exchange cards. So it's it also introduces some sentences to practice.
Mm.
I'm proud of these two projects because they're 100% community run and even were funded by our Itelmen businessmen, who which doesn't happen often.
Mm.
And responses from the community are making me inspired and think of future other
Thank
small
you.
initiatives like this. Thank you.
Thanks, Tatiana. So grateful for sharing a bit about yourself and your work and your community, and really looking forward to the next part of the discussion to learn more. With that, I want to invite Richard Grounds to introduce themselves and their work in their community. Oh, Richard, I think you might be on.
Oh, Godota. Sanakiasota Anzadik Nechi Sanle, Na Anzadik Nechi Sanle, and that la Aga Sanle, Gohantane Wayawani Abe. It's just really wonderful to be able to meet with you all. And in my language, I was trying to say it's good to see you all, but actually, I don't think I'm seeing very many of you. But it's wonderful to be able to meet together and have this discussion. And I'm reminded of what our elder Mose Kawi used to say, Yujihane no so kene no. We Yuchi people, we are still here. And it's wonderful to see so many Indigenous people who still have access to their language, who are working on bringing back their language. Our Yuchi language, just a few quick things about it. The Yuchi language is considered what they call a language isolate, meaning it's not related to any other known language. And so as our elder, I have a pen drawing of our elder and holder, Shane Sena, here behind me. And she always reminded us, she was on our board for the Yuchi Language Project, and she always reminded us that this was a special gift from the Creator that was given to our people to take care of, that we have that responsibility and that privilege of passing that language forward. And it's really kind of amazing when I think about what I've witnessed even within my lifetime. And, when I was young and coming up, Dilaha, Shane Sena, Yujiha, Saitwedini, Sahande, Wahale, Agate Jile, Saitwedini. My grandmother talked Yuchi all the time, when I was young, and I saw that. And she was part of that generation where basically the entire community, everyone grew up speaking Yuchi language. But as we've been reminded recently with some of the discoveries of mass graves in Canada from the residential schools, the boarding school situations there, that was the generation for our community, my grandmother's generation, and, where they were really taken away from the homes. That's why they were called, that's why they were boarding schools, was to get them out of the homes, make them stay someplace else so they could stop the singing, stop the dancing, stop the stories, stop really all of that Indigenous rich knowledge from being passed forward. And my grandmother was a victim of that. She went to here where I'm sitting in the town of Sapulpa, Oklahoma, what's now called Oklahoma. There's a Yuchi Mission boarding school that was here. It's been shut down now, I think about 50 years, but she went there, but in her case, she was already older. So she was in her early teens, which meant when they punished the kids, I guess she felt the impact of that punishment, but she did not lose her language. She wasn't, you know, some of the kids that were 6 and 7 years old, they literally had that language kind of knocked out of them and made it. Some of them were able to reclaim it, but many lost it through that process. But she still had her language and she carried it forward. And she was part of that generation that, you know, were punished in the boarding school system. And as you may know, they used to have this shaming process where they would wash the kids' mouths out with soap if they spoke the language of their grandparents, the language of their community. The message being that your language is ugly, the message being that your language is something that will get you in trouble. And in my grandmother's case, she didn't really lose her language, but she did stop speaking it to her kids when she had kids. So my father was never really allowed to speak the language. So what we're doing now is reclaiming the language, going back to the language. And what I've seen in my lifetime is the shift from that older generation where they all spoke the language to, you know, no kids speaking now for some generation. So it's taken us 4 generations to get back to the level of reinstituting the language into the home. So my grandkids were the first kids to start speaking the language in the home as their first language. And so we only speak to them in the Yuchi language. And that's been since, I think the last family was Richard Ray Whitman and his brothers that were raised. That was almost 70 years ago. And they were the last ones to be raised speaking the language. So we're going back to that. We're growing a new circle now of young families, young language warriors, language activists who are reclaiming the language in the home. And that's kind of the big fix. That's where you want to go, is to get the language back into the home so that it's strong there. However, you know, it's been a long process for us, and we're trying to keep our language alive, even though we are running out of those first language speakers in terms of the old guard, and now we're growing new young ones to carry our language forward.
Yawanko, thank you so much, Richard, for sharing with us a bit about your story, your family, and your community. It is an honor to listen to that, and I'm excited to learn more from you and your work as we go deeper into this conversation today. With that, I want to invite Juan to also share a bit about himself and his work and his community. Juan?
Bueno, muchas gracias, Daisy, por su amable presentación. La resistencia y lucha de los pueblos y nacionalidades indígenas ayudará a trascender y revitalizar nuestra lengua ancestral. Un camino que debemos heredar a nuestros hijos. Es nuestra responsabilidad. Saludos cordiales a todos los participantes. Mi nombre es Juan Carlos Solano. Pertenezco a la nacionalidad quichua Kañari del sur del Ecuador. Actualmente laboro como docente en el Instituto Superior Pedagógico Intercultural Bilingüe Quilloa. Provengo de una familia que habla el idioma ancestral denominado quichua. Desde muy joven sentí la falta de apoyo gubernamental y social en la enseñanza de la lengua ancestral, pues en aquel entonces todos los que hablaban el idioma ancestral quichua tenían una discriminación. Entonces, quisiera contarles un poco sobre mi vida laboral, mi gestión cultural. Soy miembro fundador del Frente Integral de Artistas y Gestores Culturales de la provincia del Cañar, denominado FIAC, originada en el año 2016. Esta organización se enfoca a realizar incidencia y empoderamiento de la Ley Orgánica de Cultura y Patrimonio establecida en el Ecuador en el año 2016. la misma que garantiza los derechos culturales y los principios de interculturalidad a nivel de la Constitución de la República del Ecuador. En el año 2017 fui parte de la red de organizaciones sociales y comunitarias dedicadas a la gestión del agua y saneamiento a nivel del Ecuador, denominada ROSGAE, del cual fui responsable de la sensibilización sobre el derecho humano al agua y saneamiento en las provincias de Chimborazo, Azuay, Cañar, Imbabura, Loja y Tungurahua. En el mismo año 2017, fui miembro fundador de la Fundación Cultural Yananti. Esta organización promueve las artes musicales sonoras de la cultura Kañari, armonizada y acompañada de la danza tradicional. Mediante sus sonidos y movimientos transmitimos nuestro idioma originario, en este caso el quichua, y también la cosmovisión de la cultura Kañari. En el año 2019, con el Instituto Superior Pedagógico Intercultural Bilingüe Quilloa, se logró generar el proyecto denominado Revitalización de la Lengua Quichua, enfocada a promover y motivar el uso de la lengua quichua a nivel de las comunidades indígenas del Cantón Cañar. Mi perspectiva de vida siempre ha sido sobre el reclamo de los derechos a favor de los pueblos y nacionalidades, como también el fortalecimiento de la identidad expresada a través de las diferentes manifestaciones artísticas culturales. Considero como parte esencial de este proceso el fortalecimiento y revitalización de las tradiciones artísticas culturales. Enfatizo, el idioma ancestral es un elemento esencial para la expresión de nuestros pensamientos, que ayuda a generar el convivir armónico y la transmisión de conocimientos en nuestras comunidades. Gracias, es mi primera parte, estimada Daisy.
Gracias, Yawanko. Thank you so much, Juan, for sharing a bit about your work and your community and some of the great things that are going on there. With that, I am also excited and pleased to invite Jennifer Weston to also introduce themselves and what they're doing in this line of work. Jennifer?
Good morning, relatives. Desawastewi amachiapi naha ia woslahe wichoti emataha toka ola naha niakie usapi emataha. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer. I wanted to introduce myself to you in my mother's first language, Lakota. And in our tradition, we introduce ourselves through our mother's line. So I told you that I am from the people of Standing Rock in the Dakotas, and I'm from the Shoots the Enemy and the Taken Alive families, although of course I'm from many other additional extended families on Standing Rock and throughout our Ochati Shakoi, our 7 Council Fire homelands. I'm from the Standing Rock Nation on the border between modern day North and South Dakota, recognized as Dakota territory through our treaty history. And as a citizen of the Great Sioux Nation, our 7 Council Fires, our Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota relatives today live throughout our traditional territories and beyond. Our modern day reservations span 4 states in the US and 3 provinces in Canada, so across what we call in our language the medicine line. So our languages are mutually intelligible and very much in a state of endangerment, but they are rising in their use. And I want to give a lot of credit to the young people, the young citizens of our Ochati Shakoi people. And I'm speaking in front of a background from one of our most sacred places, the Black Hills or the Paha Sapa, and in our Lakota language and our ceremonial language, we refer to some of the spaces you see behind me as the heart of everything that is. That's the rough English translation. And it's a place of gathering for all of our Oceti Sakowin people, and a place of annual ceremony where we gather to, draw strength and bring our families together on an annual basis. But I wanted to talk today a little bit, and I know we'll have much more time to interact, but I wanted to just lift up our young people who were successful in 2016 in reconvening our entire Oceti Sakowin, our entire 7 council fires. Our young people were able to, through prayer and ceremony and their incredibly savvy and talented use of social media and networks on the ground, they organized prayer runs, but they called our entire nation to Standing Rock. And I think the power of their young voices, really brought together a tremendous amount of hope for the revitalization and reclamation of our languages. And we have seen through the past maybe 4 or 5 decades, through the work of the tribal college movement and our parents and our grandparents' generations who have actively worked to produce younger generations of speakers, but against the tide of English and against the tide of federal and state funding and testing requirements that always prioritize, academic success in English language. And I think we finally turned a corner with our younger generations today, where we are opening immersion schools. We are raising new generations of ceremonial leaders who are able to lead us in our inipi and all of our rites of purification, all of our ceremonies in our languages once again. And it's so beautiful to see young people uplifting our voices together in unison. And I think that the gathering of water protectors that happened at Standing Rock in 2016 was instrumental in inspiring a new generation of language leaders and ceremonial leaders, not only for our Oceti Sakowin people, but throughout Indian country in the US, and for many Indigenous peoples who were able to come and visit with us and pray with us and share their songs and share stories of their own struggles to protect all of our relatives, including our homelands and our sacred waters and all of the beautiful relatives around us in the natural world that we draw strength from and depend upon for our mutual survival. So I can speak more about some of the networks and the online opportunities and the amazing work in our tribal colleges and language schools and language nests that is happening throughout our territories today. But I always want to lift up those young people who are so inspirational within the past 5 years and have just created this whole new cycle of momentum that is so inspiring and just has brought so much strength to those of us who are in our 30s and 40s and beyond and are really struggling to be that bridge to fluency for future generations. I don't know that I'll ever be a fluent speaker, but I know that I can create conditions for fluency to thrive and for young people to be supported and uplifted and empowered in their own languages. And they're already doing that work on their own as well. So thank you so much for the invitation to join with you today and to learn from all of you. It's wonderful to see your faces and hear your languages across the internet today.
Yawa, thank you so much, Jennifer, for sharing a bit more about your work and especially reminding us the importance of including youth and taking an intergenerational approach and really uplifting them and their leadership to keep our languages strong and thriving and moving forward into the future forever. So with that, thank you all again, panelists, for introducing yourselves and opening up this discussion today. And so with that, I'm ready to kick off our first question of the day. We will have 3 questions. Each of you will have plenty of time to answer. I also invite you, if you feel inclined to respond to any other points that a panelist may also talk about, please do. But the first question, which each of you will have about 6 minutes, is beyond speaking our languages in our homes, what are some of the complementary approaches that have successfully contributed to growing new fluent speakers in your community? So really focusing on building new speakers, building that fluency. What are some of the supportive approaches outside of the home that have taken place in your community and in your work? So with that, I want to invite Juan to open up this discussion. Juan?
Claro, estimada Daisy, voy a compartir la presentación, por favor. Espérese un ratito. Bueno, antes de dar respuesta a la pregunta, quisiera hacer una panorámica general de la comuna Quilloa. Como vemos en las imágenes, esta comunidad se caracteriza por el fortalecimiento y el rescate cultural en diferentes ámbitos, tanto tradicionales, de la cosmovisión, de la indumentaria, de la comida y de la música. En la actualidad, esta comunidad cuenta con alrededor de 2,000 habitantes. Está ubicada al sur del Ecuador y su lengua ancestral es el quichua. Lo característico de esta comuna es que en el corazón, en su centro comunitario, existe 2 instituciones públicas. Por un lado, la Unidad Educativa Comunitaria Intercultural Bilingüe, y por el otro, el Instituto Superior Pedagógico Intercultural Bilingüe Quilloa. Esta institución abarca a niños desde los 6 años de edad hasta jóvenes que terminan con su título de tercer nivel en calidad de tecnólogos superiores en la carrera de desarrollo infantil y también en agroecología. Esta institución fue fundada en el año de 1981 y contamos con 40 años de funcionamiento. Lo característico también de esta comuna es que existe un vínculo directo con la parte administrativa comunitaria, denominada Consejo de Gobierno Comunitario. Ellos se encargan de velar por la aplicación del sistema de educación intercultural bilingüe. Generan ellos una veeduría constante. Esta normativa a nivel nacional fue creada en el año de 1988 y garantiza la valoración y recuperación de las manifestaciones culturales y lenguas de las diversas nacionalidades y pueblos indígenas. Hasta el año 2014, la institución logró graduar a 2,100 docentes interculturales bilingües, los mismos que en la actualidad se encuentran en diferentes puntos a nivel nacional, siendo los principales en la provincia del Kañari y la provincia de la Azuay. Ellos están concentrados en escuelas comunitarias y son los responsables de transmitir la lengua quichua a los niños. Mediante la unión comunitaria con el Instituto Superior Pedagógico Intercultural Bilingüe Quilloa, se genera el proyecto denominado Revitalización de la Lengua Quichua. Gracias al apoyo y a la subvención de Cultural Survival, hemos logrado receptar la subvención de $4,300 que dio inicio a la gestión de este proyecto. Como resultado, se logró generar el desarrollo del primer juego interactivo para aplicación móvil, en este caso para Android. El juego se denomina Chungay y enfatiza la enseñanza de la lengua quichua a nivel enfocado en un rango de edad de 5 a 9 años de edad. lo característico de este juego es que, a más de enseñar la lengua, las primeras palabras de lengua quichua, el niño al momento de jugar se siente identificado con los personajes del juego debido a su indumentaria, a su panorámica general a nivel del contexto comunitario. Otro resultado que hemos logrado al momento de hacer el lanzamiento de esta aplicación, de la aplicación móvil, es un tipo de incidencia social a nivel de los gobiernos autónomos, al nivel del gobierno local de acá del Cantón Cañar, porque se colocó como padrinos a la autoridad máxima, en este caso al concejal y al alcalde. Y gracias a este apadrinamiento, el alcalde nos designó para el presupuesto 2020 $10,000 para destinar a adecuación de laboratorios enfocados a la enseñanza de la lengua quichua. Sin embargo, esto no fue posible receptar debido a que apareció en el año 2020 el confinamiento por la pandemia mundial del COVID-19 y tuvieron que priorizar los gastos del gobierno autónomo a la minimización y mitigación del COVID-19. Con la aplicación se logró llegar a diferentes puntos y escuelas comunitarias a nivel del Cantón Cañar, donde los niños se sintieron muy identificados con el juego y se sintieron estimulados para aprender las primeras palabras del quichua. Se llegó de forma personal a 460 personas entre niños y adultos, se sensibilizó, y de manera virtual alrededor de 3,000 personas. También, mediante la gestión de esta aplicación móvil, se generó vínculos con otras instituciones de educación. En este caso, se realizó un vínculo muy fuerte con la Universidad de la SUAY, ubicada en la provincia de la SUAY. Y gracias a este vínculo se generó el primer diccionario quichua, español, inglés, en donde se da la iniciativa y valor a estos 3 idiomas, al aprendizaje de estos 3 idiomas. De forma paralela, se generaron eventos académicos como el primer simposio Educación, Identidad, Lengua e Interculturalidad, organizado por el Instituto Superior Pedagógico Intercultural Bilingüe, como también formamos parte del primer Congreso Internacional de Educación, Lenguas Indígenas, Territorios del Saber e Interculturalidad, organizado por la Universidad Nacional de Educación. También se logró dar a conocer la aplicación móvil Chungay en la 4ª Jornadas de Escuelas Innovadoras organizada por la Universidad Nacional de Educación. Es necesario también resaltar la importancia de diferentes agrupaciones musicales y culturales que invierten su tiempo, que invierten su dinero, mediante autogestión ellos generan sus productos musicales en donde enfatizan el idioma ancestral quichua para el fortalecimiento tanto de la lengua, el aprendizaje de la lengua y de la identidad quichua Kañari. Esa sería mi presentación, estimada Daisee.
Thank you so much, Juan. Really appreciate you sharing a bit about the multiple institutions and approaches that your community is working towards revitalizing your language and really uplifting the usage of technology and how to engage the young people in learning the language, especially through those mobile applications. Next, I want to move to Tatiana to take a few minutes to also discuss the ways that your community is approaching this work outside of the home and building fluency in speakers in your community. Tatiana?
Thank you. It was stated already many times at this conference, but I want to stress again that language cannot be separated, in our case, from Kamchatka land, Kamchatka River, Pacific Ocean, Sea of Okhotsk, and indigenous wisdom. All are tightly interdependent and have long-time relationships. Therefore, when we speak about language revitalization, we speak about referring to traditional lands and waters. One of the long-time projects that I'd like to introduce today, and we are trying to finish, is creating a traditional cultural maps in Itelmen language. We have many Itelmen place names recorded, but we don't have enough stories from and about those places. On the slide, you see photographs from the Google shop that we organized in the village of Kavran, where most Itelmens live now. We try to teach children to use Google mapping tools to map cultural places around the village. We had elders come to share their stories, both in classroom, as you see in the middle picture. There's this elder who is, looking at the existing map and, sharing her memories from that place. And also we went outside to the seashore and had a storytelling circle. While, this is not a new idea, and we are learning from great examples from our brothers and sisters that already advanced their cultural and linguistic maps. But this idea is quite new and innovative to Itelmens, and hopefully we will be able to compile a comprehensive story of our land sometime in near future. Another example I'd like to share. A very informal, unconventional method that we introduced to language learning is puppet theater and shadow theater. For this, we had special puppets made that are representative of our traditional stories. Some stories are told in Itelmen, some are a mix of Itelmen and Russian. We introduced this form as a stage performance for the villagers, both adults and children, in consultation with the elders and knowledge holders. These have shown to be rather effective, bringing back the language. First, the actors have to learn the script in the language, and then the villagers are invited to watch and understand what the story is about. Usually we choose famous stories that everybody knows, and therefore they can understand most of it if it is solely in Itelmen language. This idea went beyond the puppet theater and into the classroom, where children themselves created their own paper dolls and staged their own stories. And this is one of the most favorite activities of children who are learning Itelmen at school. Also, our community now has come to understanding that we need to go beyond the classroom and celebrate our language in other spaces. Itelmens are famous for their dance. We love to perform. Itelmen dance plays a major role in helping young generation be proud of who they are and therefore are interested in their language. Dancing teaches us not only to be not to be shy about our identity, be vocal about who we are and where we came from. Being shy in a dominant society where people are looking at you as at a savage or less developed people is often a strong barrier to learning the language and remembering your roots. Itelmen language is very much alive during singing and dancing at ceremonies, festivals, and celebrations. Those who practice singing and dancing enjoy showing off their language skills. To support this movement, we also developed a karaoke DVD that was followed by other initiatives of books of Itelmen songs. Those songs are very old and some are new that were translated. Some are translations of famous Russian songs that Itelmens love. So this is plays a huge and important role in language revitalization. Of course, when we talk about language revitalization in the 21st century, we can technology, as we've heard from Juan as well, plays an important role. And we use WhatsApp platform as our language sharing tool. In COVID, we also started Zoom lessons of Itelmen language. And one, of the latest huge, news, huge achievements for Itelmen is the audiovisual dictionary that it represents a work of many generations of language speakers of the recordings and word lists from the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, the work of linguists and anthropologists, educators. So this is the most comprehensive dictionary of Itelmen language, and we are also working on the website of the dictionary that will be trilingual, Russian, English, and Itelmen, that will have stories. Well, it will have the actual dictionary. It already has actual dictionary. It will have also supporting stories about the language speakers who shared their knowledge, and it will have also available resources for upload for those who want to know more and learn more about language. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. There are so many great examples you shared and the way that your community is working together to keep your language strong and thriving. With that, I want to invite Jennifer to also respond on this topic and the ways that your community is building fluency, building speakers, and those complementary approaches that are taking place outside of the home. Jennifer?
Thank you. I think some of the programs I'd like to lift up are using some of the same techniques, but one focus in particular among Lakota and Dakota relatives and some of our Nakota relatives as well have been the language nest movement. So building upon the intergenerational preschool model where we have aunties and uncles and grandparents in the classroom with second language learner teachers. And the school on Standing Rock is based at our tribal college at Sitting Bull College. They have been in operation since about 2014, although there was a long planning process before that to identify and train teachers and also to visit other language nests, including some of the founders of this language medium education model among the Native Hawaiians at Ahapunanaleo. The Akwesasne Freedom School has also been a tremendous mentor to so many language medium schools in the mainland US and schools among the Navajo and the Inupiat language as well, where this language nest and language classroom model brings fluent speakers into collaboration with adult second language learners while they are simultaneously teaching young children. So it's very challenging for that middle generation of teachers who are learning while they are also teaching, and the children learn so much faster, as we know, as adult learners, it's very hard to stay ahead of the young people and their language development in those early years. But I think that is one of the most effective and promising out of the home approaches that we've seen among our Oceti Sakowin communities. And just really want to express gratitude to the elders who have the energy, to commute. And, on Standing Rock, our reservation land base is about 3,600 square miles. So we have some grandpas who get on the bus every morning and they ride to the tribal college, and then they're in a classroom with, squirmy toddlers and, young elementary students. And, they really do this out of their love for our families and the joy of being able to use their language every day with more than one generation in this classroom setting. And it's beautiful to see the videos and some of the programs that are shared with us in the broader community, where the children are out on the land, learning prayer songs, learning traditional gardening or harvesting, gathering, and learning the prayers and the offerings and the respect and reciprocity and those practices that come with these seasonal practices in our communities. I think we've also had success with some master apprentice program work where we have in local communities weekly or a couple nights a week, first language speakers coming together and mentoring learners. I think that's an effective model, though it can be very challenging to build up enough exposure to the language as a second language learner. But I think one of the things that I've seen be really effective during the last year and a half of the pandemic is master apprentice programs that are paired with online instructional opportunities. I'm thinking of the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation down on Pine Ridge, who has a 4 years to fluency program that they opened up to all of us in Lakota and Dakota, Nakota, our kinship networks. And I was able to participate in about 16 weeks of online language instruction, 3 or 4 nights a week for, just very small chunks of time, maybe 45 minutes to an hour. But it was a really just exciting part of my day. I was connecting with Oceti Sakowin relatives who were sometimes on the West Coast or in, much more urban areas, or it was a really diverse group of people. But we were able to come together several nights a week and share that commitment to our language lessons and have some really practical scripts that we could work on together and try out our pronunciation. And I think as adult language learners, that's the hardest part, is really challenging ourselves to make mistakes and not be afraid of making those mistakes in front of others. It's really getting past our own self-consciousness and, just worried about feeling embarrassed by saying something incorrect in the language. But having that frequency of time together online in such an informal space where we were hearing many different variations and many different dialects and many different related vocabulary terms. So we were learning about how our language has persisted among our communities in all its variation and its beauty. And it's not necessary to standardize or to only have one way of saying something. And that, I think, was one really powerful aspect of us being able to come together in a virtual setting in such an informal way, where I would never have imagined being able to learn Lakota and to improve my guttural pronunciations and, just to really have that repetition of the musculature where you're using these different ways of pronouncing terms that are so different from English or other Indigenous languages. So it's really that repetition that's important. And then being able to use that in the home, but also just out in the world, just out going about your daily chores and routines. The last program I wanted to highlight on Standing Rock in particular is happening in my hometown public school in McLaughlin, South Dakota, in our Bear Soldier district. And I'm just so excited to see the new ways that some of our young Lakota, Dakota language teachers are pairing traditional storytelling with plain sign language. I think there's something about that pairing of the motion. There's just something about the learning process that I think is reinforced when you're pairing speech with that sort of like total physical response or TPR approach as well, where there's action happening in the language, and you're out on the land, you're listening to a story from an elder, or you're learning a traditional song, and you may not, as a learner, understand all of the context or the richness of the vocabulary, but the mapping is happening internally because of the song, because of the story, because of the motion. And then I think the genius piece for me was seeing the plain sign language also being added into that, because that's very much an endangered practice among tribes of the Northern Plains as well. So that's really exciting to me to see that being utilized and put on YouTube, and just giving us all a chance to experience some of those gestures and that cultural knowledge that's so much reliant on intertribal diplomacy, and something that was part of our ancestral politics and process of negotiation, where all of our ancestors were multilingual. They always spoke more than one Indigenous language. And sometimes we focus so much on just wanting to speak our own language, but we forget that we had relatives in very recent memory who could communicate in multiple Indigenous languages, and then also had a knowledge of sign language. So those are some of the exciting innovations. There's so many more, but I think those are some of the ones that I wanted to highlight today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I just really want to uplift the powerful reminders that you shared of the resiliency of our communities and our languages, and also the diversity, even within nations or a confederacy, of the diversity of dialects in the way that our relatives are speaking the language. And just sharing a bit about my experience as a language learner, I'm often taught and reminded from my own teacher that it's okay to make mistakes, right? And that reminding ourselves that even one act, or speaking one word, is an act of resistance. It's an act of reclamation. And even if we're mispronouncing it in that moment, we're still making our ancestors proud. And I just really wanted to give gratitude to you in sharing those reminders with all of us here today. With that, we're going to move towards our second question, to Richard. Sorry, Richard, are wanting to give you space to also comment on the incredible ways that your community, your family, yourself are working to provide these supportive, complementary approaches to creating fluent speakers, building fluency, building speakers in your community. Sorry about that, Richard. So excited to hear what you have to say.
Really appreciate all of the wonderful input and comments from our friends on this panel and throughout the conference, but I'll try to just say a few quick things about the language beyond the home. The point of framing it that way, I guess, is that the most important space is keeping our languages alive in our own homes, so that our children are growing up speaking our languages as their first language. And this is something that is becoming more and more of a challenge. There's so many pressures against us. When I was talking about the expression of our elder, Mose Kawi, a little bit ago, saying, "Yujihane no son kene no." We Yuchi people, we are still here. Perhaps I should explain the kind of the framework for that, the background for that. The Yuchi nation has been written about in government reports, in historical publications as extinct. We've been written about in dictionaries and encyclopedias about Native American nations as an extinct people. This has literally been going on for 2 centuries. And so it's in this kind of a context that we're trying to overcome all of this inertia and challenge that's been trying to suppress our languages, the millions of dollars that were spent taking our kids out of the home so they could, take them off to boarding schools. And it's very exciting now to hear these successful programs that are reclaiming some of the boarding school space, or even public schools, or starting separate immersion schools. But I just wanted to comment a little bit about what are some of the bottom line underlying programmatic things that have to be in place in order to grow new speakers. Our goal is to keep alive our languages. Our goal is to move our young people into the future empowered, knowing who they are, knowing how to pray in their languages, knowing how to sing the songs and tell their stories. And the language is key to all of that. So you've heard about, I was really glad to hear, we've had references to languages in the school setting. We've heard references to language in terms of language nests as a beautiful model, and a little reference also to master apprentice. But whatever method you're using, it's absolutely essential. As far as we know, the only way to grow new speakers is to have them in immersion. By that, I mean they're hearing the language, they're staying in the language, they're immersed in a language environment. They're actually learning the language through the language. We're not talking about long classes where we're explaining in the colonial language how the language works or what the language is. We're talking about immersion in the language. And for us, our goal in the Yuchi community has really been to grow new speakers of the language, not per se fluency. We're not opposed to people, not per se literacy. We're not opposed to people learning to read the language. It's not a bad thing. But, as I learned in my graduate school experience, I learned to read German, French. May Allah je ne parle pas bien, n'est-ce pas? My French is lousy, but I can read it if it's printed. And that's very different than actually being able to speak and communicate with our elders. So just to say, there's ultimately no replacement for growing new speakers for the immersion element. That's got to be a core, whether it's in the schools, whether it's in a language nest, or whether it's through master apprentice. And that immersion needs to be also related to, there's a time element. Sometimes you hear about these quick fixes. Someone may be offering an instant solution to growing new speakers, or maybe a digital fix. But the reality is that we emphasize face-to-face, breath-to-breath learning, ideally from our elders. But ultimately, there is a time element. You have to use the language. You have to speak the language. You have to learn to hear. You have to retrain your ears. If your ears are only used to hearing the colonial language, there are sounds in your language that you have to retrain your ears in order to pick it up. So that is to say, these are kind of core elements. Whatever method you're using, you have to have that immersion in the language. And I just want to maybe frame very briefly kind of the contrast. And in all honesty, we are amazed. We're kind of awestruck by those indigenous nations who are able to put together language immersion schools. If you can do that, that's the big fix. That's the major solution. If you can take the institution of the school system that was used to crush our languages for many generations and now turn that around and make that a tool to empower our children, to empower our families to reclaim their languages. That's kind of the big fix. But the challenge with that is you have to have a lot of resources. You have to have a lot of chaso in order to pay for the overhead, the teachers, the physical space. There's the whole curriculum, educational materials. But if you have the resources, if you have the numbers of speakers, if you have the funding, if you have the capacity to take over the public schools, whatever it is that can be an effective, that's kind of the highest level, because you're developing entire cohorts of new learners, new groups of new learners. But on the other end of the scale, the small ball, I call it, you have the master apprentice level, where you don't have to have a big budget to think about providing heat in the winter. You don't have to be purchasing educational books and thinking about desks and cleaning staff and all of the developmental things that are required to run an entire school. At the other end of the scale is this really small scale working directly with elders through master apprentice. And the approach here is the most critical piece is to grow new, competent, fluent speakers of the language to carry it forward. So the master apprentice is really a good way to grow new speakers who themselves can then become teachers in an immersion school, who can then become the parents who are raising their kids in the language, which is what we are now starting to do in the Yuchi community, which is just an amazing blessing and opportunity for us. But just to throw out a few quick things around complementary elements that we think have really been helpful for us. Just to be clear, the underlying issue for our languages and the growing of new speakers ultimately really hinges on that internal motivation. Where do you go to find those individuals, those families who are committed to carrying forward their language, their culture, their medicine knowledge? And it's mostly the ceremonial families. It's mostly the traditional families. So we really have emphasized trying to work specifically with our ceremonial, actively involved ceremonial families. We also have taken the Master Apprentice program and kind of expanded it. Our most critical voice in the language learning process is the voice of our elders. We always focus on our elders. We prioritize their voices, the way they say it, their pronunciation, not my attempt to recapitulate or recapture what they have said, but directly from them as much as we can. And of course, at the same time, our learners, I guess we've been kind of slow in learning. That falls on me. I'm a little bit of a slow learner, apparently. But we started working with adults, even older adults, and then middle-aged adults, and then young young adults, and eventually now we're working with our newborn babies. And I love the comment from Magus in the earlier session, if you were able to see that, where he was talking about starting with pre-verbal babies. This at some level speaks to this enormous influence of the colonial framing that we're all trying to push back on and get some space to work in, which is to say that, I'll give you a quick example. I remember Zeisani Hontole, Gakale Honjwa Honta Nejaditayu. And we had this kind of one of these parent-child little dramatic exchanges where he was wanting me to say that I loved him in the English language. And I just felt it was so important to say everything that matters about life and death and love in our language. So I always told him, Nedzi Tayu. And at one point when he was a young boy, he was getting frustrated. He wanted me to say that in English to him. And, you know, after children get older, this becomes a real challenge to try to bring back the language. Whereas, you know, if you start them pre-verbal or just as babies, there's really no resistance. They're just sponges absorbing whatever language they're around. So that's one way to bypass some of the colonial influence that so quickly can lead to pushback on our languages. So I'm just trying to identify a few of the things that we have done by getting the language back to younger and younger kids. But the goal is to grow new, fluent, culturally competent speakers who can carry it forward. So the beauty of the master apprentice approach is that it kind of inverts the learning process. Instead of having like a community class where a lot of people in the community learn a little bit of the language, they learn kind of the classic, the typical low-hanging fruit. Let's learn colors, let's learn animals, let's learn numbers to count, you know, these kind of simple things. That's not, you know, real language. It's a starting point, but it's certainly not the goal. So what we're trying to do is get a few young people instead of a lot of people that know a little bit of the language. We're kind of basically turning that around and taking the focus of the knowledge, the experience, of the spirit of our elders to invest that in a few people in more intensive amount of time through like a master apprentice approach, where they're getting lots of language every day and they're immersed in the language and they're learning the language in the language. They're acting out the language, they're performing the language. And through that process, then they will have the fullness of the language to pass it on to the coming generations. So it's not necessarily a final solution, but it's a really important bridge to get new young people who can carry the language forward. And that's a key piece of it. I may be over my time, so I just wanted to maybe end there, but Sanaki Asuta, appreciate all the comments and input and the amazing experience and learning that we're hearing about today. Sanaki Asuta.
Yawankoa, thank you so much, Richard, for sharing these different examples and really wanting to uplift, as you had mentioned, the element of time, right, in learning these languages, both at an individual, collective, and community level. And there are so many different approaches, as you all had named. And what I also want to speak to, especially on Turtle Island, the way that our communities are working across nations too, to learn from each other in these practical examples. One that you had mentioned, Jennifer, was the Akwesasne Freedom School. One thing I did not share in my opening is my sister, amongst many community members, runs a language nest, the Te Harina Aqua language nest. And a lot of that learning came from Indigenous peoples back in Akwesasne, as well as Hawaii, right? And so the ways that we're working across waterways and landscapes to learn from each other, and how we're also doing that here in this digital space, right? And learning the innovative tools and examples, whether it be mobile applications to language immersion to all of the examples shared here today, that we are keeping our languages live and resilient and moving them forward. And within that spirit of time, time is not in our favor today, but we will keep moving forward in a good way and move to the next question here. So the next question is, what are some of the main obstacles, either within the community or outside of the community, that have made it difficult to grow new speakers? And how are you overcoming them in your work? So again, we don't have as much time as I'd like, but wanting to invite each of you to take about 3 minutes or so. I know there's so much more to all this. And again, that's where like Swap Card is a really great platform that we can continue this discussion, as well as the interactive working space after the session. But again, what are the main obstacles that you are facing in this work, and how is your community overcoming them? With that, I am going to ask Jennifer to start us off.
Sure, I'll keep it very brief, but I think the one thing that I always want to call out is our education system's obsessions with high stakes testing, which is always conducted in English language. It's something that even in tribal communities, I think we have internalized this idea of measuring progress and growth and proficiency to the detriment of our children's ability to learn at their own natural rate of progression, and in a setting that is not teaching to the test, that is not focused around a standardized test. And those of us who have run or funded language nests or schools know very well, all too well, funders focus on measuring proficiency and working with colleagues in public school or tribal school settings, where testing and demonstrating progress and proficiency across academic areas is nearly always tied to some sort of standardized test. So I think that's a real challenge that many of us navigate, and it's something that tribal parents ask for as well. They want to make sure that their children's educational experience in an Indigenous language is not somehow hindering their young person's success, quote, success, ability to succeed in English. So I think we do still have within our communities internally a focus on measuring proficiency in colonial languages, unfortunately. And I think that's something we just have to keep pushing through by continuing to empower young people to show how brilliant they are, that they can learn in 2 or 3 or 4 languages as young people, and they will do just fine. We don't need to have a percentile rating system to measure growth in our Indigenous languages, but it's something that I'm often discouraged by in dealing with funders or dealing with school systems. So just want to highlight that.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Yawanko, the powerful reminder of decolonizing and indigenizing and redefining what proficiency, progress, and success means for our communities, as it is a reflection of our worldview and not the Western worldview. Thank you so much. Wanting to move to Juan to also share a bit about some of the obstacles that he is facing in his community in terms of this work, and how you are all navigating that.
Ya, bueno, sí. En verdad, uno de los principales factores a nivel del contexto nacional y mundial que afecta de forma directa a la reducción de quichua hablantes, en nuestro caso a nivel comunitario, es la falta de poder de credibilidad para la construcción de una autodeterminación personal. Sí, en verdad, entendiendo a la autodeterminación como la capacidad de un individuo para decidir por sí mismo sobre la importancia de mantener nuestra identidad cultural. Pero ¿por qué existe esta falta de autodeterminación? Bueno, en primer plano, este suceso es ocasionado a causa de una escasa motivación y de estímulos para el fortalecimiento del idioma ancestral. Los jóvenes y los chicos se sienten desmotivados, no tienen ese apoyo gubernamental también existen pocos programas para para iniciarse en este idioma. Hasta la fecha existe demasiada discriminación. Pero ¿por qué existe esta falta de apoyo financiero, digamos, por parte del Estado ecuatoriano en este caso? Yo pienso que uno de los mayores factores a nivel del contexto global es la corrupción. Nuestro país, el Ecuador, según el informe CESLA de julio 2021, tiene un porcentaje alto de corrupción, el 66% en base a este indicador, considerado como uno de los países en rango alto de corrupción. Según el Banco Mundial, estima que la industria del soborno mueve entre 1.5 a 2 billones de dólares a nivel mundial. La Organización de las Naciones Unidas añade que al menos el 2.6 billones de dólares se pierden en enriquecimiento ilícito, evasión de impuestos y otros actos de corrupción. Entonces, la falta de una correcta administración gubernamental y escasez de trabajo digno, por otro lado, desmotiva a los ciudadanos, a los habitantes de las zonas rurales, y ellos emigran de forma masiva a otros países, en este caso siendo Estados Unidos como uno de los países receptores de esta emigración. Esto ha provocado la transmutación de costumbres, tradiciones causados por el efecto de la globalización. Las comunidades indígenas pertenecientes al Cantón Kañar no son la excepción hasta la fecha. En la actualidad existe una desterritorialización geográfica voluntaria, lo llamamos nosotros. En algunos casos, los ciudadanos emigran para mejorar su situación de vida económica y en otros por unir a sus familias que ya emigraron en fechas anteriores. Esto ha ocasionado grandes transmutaciones y ruptura de sus tradiciones. A más de lo mencionado, durante la pandemia mundial se ha apreciado el excesivo posicionamiento de las redes sociales a nivel de las comunidades indígenas, debido a que muchos hogares tuvieron que contratar un servicio de internet fijo para las casas, para el desarrollo de las clases virtuales. Esta adopción de la nueva realidad ha modificado la forma de pensar, de actuar en los niños y jóvenes, pues ha conllevado a desvalorar su idioma ancestral. Es necesario generar estrategias para minimizar el impacto a nivel de nuestras comunidades. Sin duda no podremos contrarrestar al 100% todos los males, de esto estoy muy seguro, pero sí podemos minimizar el impacto mediante la implementación de proyectos sociales, programas sociales que beneficien la adaptabilidad y, por ende, la revitalización de nuestra identidad. Es necesario que unamos esfuerzos para lograr la revitalización de nuestras lenguas ancestrales.
Gracias, Yawonko. Thank you so much, Juan. I'm just wanting to uplift a few things you shared. That both that learning and speaking and teaching our languages is of course an act of reclamation, but it exercising our rights, our self-determination and our sovereignty as Indigenous peoples, as well as speaking to some of the external challenges and how those vary across our communities across the world, especially when it comes to these colonial nation states and countries, right? And a lot of their those countries' conflicts and their corruption and how that impacts our communities economically, politically, and socially as we work to revitalize and strengthen our languages and our cultures. Thank you so much for uplifting those points. With that, I want to hand it to Tatiana to also share, to take a few minutes to share about some of the obstacles and challenges that your community is experiencing, both either internally or externally, and the ways that you are all addressing and navigating that to continue to build new speakers. Tatiana?
I fully support of what has been said today in the panel, and we experience very similar challenges at home. And the first and most important one is that we have one language speaker left. And this speaker does not live in the area where most active language learning is happening. because of no fluent speakers around, it is extremely difficult to create language environment with full immersion. And I know from my own experience, when you don't know the language enough, it takes hours of preparation to develop a language learning environment for just half an hour of immersion practice. Another challenge is a new mode of life that is very different from traditional ways of living. And, yesterday, our Meskwaki brother, Marcus Briggs Cloud, he mentioned, about the impact of industrialization on our lives. And we do indeed sing and dance faster today. People in Russia and the Russian setting must work to live. Everything else should be done outside of the work time, which is a very short amount of period. Therefore, we see now most active learners of the language are children, retired people, or those who have flexible jobs. Another challenge is that a strong focus on reading and writing, as well as other myths on language learning, are strongly embedded in our minds. And while some have this understanding that these are not the only ways you can keep the language, others are very, very focused on this way of revitalizing languages. There is also a lack of clear understanding both among those who make decisions and community itself that it is not our fault that we do not speak our language. Therefore, lack of understanding that more substantial and meaningful investment should be done towards this goal, such as investment into the master's and apprentice language programs, immersion schools, or at least language immersion camps. There is also lack of understanding or will that the standardization of school programs do more harm than good for Indigenous communities and their language. We have a lack of understanding of the role heritage language play in building community well-being, advancing sustainable development goals, and peacemaking. Yesterday, we had a beautiful discussion about the links between the languages and biodiversity. Those who have power have very little, if any, understanding about these links. What meanings these links bring to the humanity and why they are crucial to life on Earth. I will bring just one example on how members of our community try to keep traditional lifeways and bring the language back within or despite the existing system and realities. In Russia, all land belongs to the state. By law, if you want to have your own piece of land, you have to participate in land auctions. And then if you win, you are allowed to rent it for some time. We have cases among Itelmen today when they rented the land for the purposes of leading traditional lifestyle. Having your own land, even temporarily, provides an opportunity to strengthen Indigenous knowledge, including relearning the language. Having your own land, even temporarily, allows to have freedom from the contemporary mode of life, formal systems, and imposed ways of living. This way, Itelmen themselves and other Indigenous communities in Russia create their own spaces to live in harmony with nature, ancestors, and self. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, for a lot of many powerful points that you shared, and particularly reminding us that it's not our fault. Colonization is not our fault. The fact that we don't know our languages maybe as fluently from one to the next, it's not our fault. But this investment of time and commitment is what moves us forward, both individually and collectively, to reclaiming our languages and revitalizing them. You also spoke a lot about the necessary education, community education that is required to have these conversations, to understand that these systems like, modern education is not in our favor and is oftentimes a barrier in understanding and prioritizing our own languages and the way and our approaches to that. And lastly, really uplifting the importance of accessing lands, and that our lands and our languages cannot be separated, and both are needed to keep our languages, our cultures, and our communities strong. So with that, I will hand it to Richard to take us home on this last question here of some of the challenges that your community is facing and how you are navigating them.
Sana kia sota kala hongwahado tash ale. What has been said, I really appreciate it. This discussion about re-indigenizing our communities, our spaces, our youth. I think it's just such a critical conversation, and all of that is facilitated, can happen through our languages. One of the messages that I've tried to communicate to our formal tribal government leaders is to kind of be aware that we've really shifted from the old days. We have to be intentional about it. It's no longer the case for hardly any of our communities where kids are just growing up in the language, where they're just naturally picking up their songs and their ceremonies and their traditional knowledge. We have to be intentional about it in a way that didn't happen, say, 2 generations ago. It wasn't required because there was so much time, so much of a natural progression that was still in place for most of our communities. So we're trying to be intentional about it and be smart about it in this context where we're dealing with this larger colonial pressure and frame that's just, it's everywhere. And I think that's in some ways part of our big challenge. And one of the ways that it shows up externally, the challenge area has to do with what's already been kind of identified, but just to name it, it is a real challenge around the funding. Most of the money is being directed toward academic projects, not community-based revitalization projects. And I think maybe it's helpful to identify that, to name that. And likewise, the academic structure is a very colonial framework. Again, if you want a measure of that, it has to do with the amount of money that's going to academic programs, archives, institutions, universities, museums, libraries, to document, to study our languages from an external point of view. I say that 99% of the money that's going to our languages right now, the millions of dollars being spent on Indigenous languages, is going to these colonial intellectual projects. They're not always necessarily harmful or negative in their impact, but they're tangential, they're off point, they're less critical than the important, the place that our languages really matter is in our communities, is in our homes, is in our ceremonies. And in that sense, we're still living in an extremely colonial frame that is being kind of controlled by academic interests. Academic voices are advising the foundations, are setting up the funds, and it's hard to even get funding to come to our own communities, which is related to the issue of having time. If our young people, our young parents are having to work outside the home in a job 40, 50, 60 hours a week, and then try to learn the language as a secondary process, that becomes even more challenging. So one of the things we've been trying to do is generate funding, try to find funding to bring young people in to become full-time workers on the language project so they can dedicate themselves to really mastering the language, because it is in this colonial frame, a big challenge for them to have the time to learn the language. And I don't say that any of these fixes are complete, but certainly I think we can push for any institution, any government funding, any program that's handing out funding to study our languages, to document our languages, to produce formal dictionaries. An equal amount of funding needs to go to our communities, to our living dictionaries, to our young people, so that we can grow new fluent speakers who can carry that language forward. That's where the language ultimately matters the most. And so I'm hoping that even by identifying this, by naming it, by being clear about this, and I'm not trying to pick a fight with our academic friends and supporters. I'm just trying to be clear about the nature of what this relationship is like, the colonial framing that still defines our roles and defines the tracks along which the great bulk of the funding and support and activity goes toward the study of our languages rather than actually to our grassroots level community language work. Likewise, so that's kind of the external challenges, and just a quick word about the internal impacts. This means that the colonial framing is just seeping into our young people. Our young people are, I've tried to even name this to identify it for our young people by saying, they're trying to turn you into zombies. They're trying to put you in some old black and white sci-fi movie where you cannot afford to go to sleep. You still look like an Indigenous person. You still have the brown skin and the dark hair, but internally, your passions, your desires, your language are all being shaped. You're being drawn away internally to turn into something else. And that's really a big challenge to try to overcome that internalization. We're trying to overcome the assault on the prestige of our languages. I have here on the wall behind me, you may not recognize this larger figure above me. That is Yuchi Einstein. This is Yuchi Stein. The reason we promoted this image of the Yuchi Einstein was to tell our young people, you know what, if you speak your language, you're really smart. You are like crazy smart, like Einstein smart. So we're trying to, overcome these negative messages that I grew up with. In particular, it's a little more subtle now in our area, but there used to be all these Indian jokes about dumb Indians and all of these kind of racist slurs that were built into our social environment. And so we're trying to empower our young people to be proud of themselves, to be proud of their languages, the way they look, and the diversity of how we look. We have mixed families across different tribes and with European and African heritage, and it's all about affirming all of our young people and re-indigenizing our community now and moving forward. So we're hoping that at some level, by being intentional and even naming, identifying what some of the challenges are, will help us to be smarter about recognizing them and addressing them and overcoming them. I hope that was somehow helpful.
Thank you so much, Richard. Yes, very helpful, and really wanting to uplift, as you had mentioned, the various colonial frameworks and external institutions and systems that are oftentimes defining and tracking and determining the availability of resources and access to those resources to help resource and fund our languages and those efforts. We are coming to a close. I did have one more question, and I also wanted to leave space for closing remarks. So what I'll do is combine them, and feel free to share what you're called to share. But Richard, you did really speak a lot to the resource challenge of this work. And that is a real issue that we're all navigating in different ways, and also wanting to expand resourcing, both financial and non-financial, right? There are many resources that we need to do this work. And so I want to invite the panelists to each take 2 minutes, that's all the time we have left each, to talk about maybe some effective ways, or an example of an effective way that you all have done to resource the work. And also any general closing remarks or words of wisdom and inspiration that you would like to leave with our audience here, who many I might assume are also language learners. So with that, I'm going to hand it to Jennifer to start us off to begin closing this discussion.
Thank you, Daisy. I think I wanted to just close with highlighting the idea, the concept of data sovereignty, and the ways that we need to protect our intellectual property as Indigenous peoples, as we are increasingly collaborating with academic institutions and folks in the linguistic community who may not be locally trained or local citizens of our communities. And want to highlight Richard's earlier calls for Native American languages Rematriation Act, or a piece of comprehensive national legislation comparable to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, where we have a national policy that gives primacy to our intellectual property and reserves that knowledge, preserves that knowledge for our current and future generations. I think that guiding legislation and policy making around this concept would really help address the resource issue. So I just wanted to highlight that, because I think as we're coming upon the opening of the decade of the world's indigenous languages, this is an area of policy focus where we can find common ground despite our very diverse circumstances, and perhaps a model here in the US context could also inform intellectual property rights protections in other areas of Indigenous leadership and protections. Thank you.
Yawas, thank you so much, Jennifer, for your closing remarks and for all the wisdom and learnings that you generously shared with us today, and for participating with alongside of us here in this important discussion. With that, I'm going to turn it to Tatiana to invite you to share some closing remarks as well. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to express my gratitude, and I feel very honored to share this space with all of you, to be able to learn and hear your stories and your experience, to be able to rethink on some things that we can apply effectively back at home. To you all, and I want to mention, that we have very small number of Indigenous experts who can advocate effectively in the language of policy. And these people are overwhelmed by the amount of work. I believe that more investment should be done in training Indigenous advocates who can speak both the language of the policy and the language of their community. In Russian case, we have just a handful of people who are knowledgeable enough in both Indigenous knowledge and policy making, to be able to effectively advocate. And this is a rare skill. Also, advocacy is more effective if we advocate as a community. It is important to stay united both within our own communities and as a global Indigenous community. Being united strengthens our visions and knowledge and advocacy skills. And as a final remark, I just want to tell that I'm very happy to observe now that Itelmen philanthropists are supporting language revitalization initiatives that are coming from the ground. While it is extremely difficult to get meaningful support from the top, Itelmen, by doing their own thing, by learning the language their way, become more and more knowledgeable and visible. This should have an impact someday on those who make decisions, and I remain hopeful. Keche.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, for joining us today and sharing so much of your wisdom and your teachings and the work that your community is doing to keep your language strong. With that, I want to hand it to Juan to share some closing remarks as well today. Thank you, Juan.
Bueno, sí, en verdad concuerdo mucho con Tatiana, que es necesario una articulación global desde diferentes puntos comunitarios de diferentes partes del mundo. Esta retroalimentación que a veces uno mismo ya lo va perdiendo debido a la excesiva globalización, las causas que uno también es víctima, digamos, de ese lado, ¿no? Pero es necesario que este tipo de eventos se sigan construyendo. Gracias más bien a la Fundación Cultural Survival por unirnos. No, desconocía que en diferentes puntos del mundo se trabajaba y se trataba de fortalecer la lengua ancestral realmente. Bueno, en nuestro caso, para generar el proyecto denominado Revitalización de la Lengua Quichua, tuvimos que articular 4 ejes indispensables: la parte académica, la parte de la base social, la parte comunitaria, la parte, en este caso, a Cultural Survival, a quienes nos apoyaron con el financiamiento, y por otro lado, las instituciones públicas de acá del Ecuador. Pienso que se debería hacer esta sinergia para seguir construyendo en diferentes puntos la revitalización de la lengua quichua. Anhelamos realmente llegar y construir el Pachacuti que nosotros conocemos a nivel andino, que es el retorno de los tiempos, el retorno de los pueblos andinos a nivel de nuestras comunidades. Muchas gracias, estimada Daisy.
Gracias, Niawankoa, so much, Juan, for joining us today and especially sharing that visual and the overlap of the approaches of this work and how we keep our languages strong. Lastly, I want to turn it over to Richard. We have about 90 seconds left to bring us to a close and some of your closing remarks.
Oh, Salake Asota, Kalahotel, Asogwa, really quick comment. Dikyawani Tahe. Working together, we can move it forward. We want to work with all of the stakeholders from the academic community, from governmental levels, and we have to figure out a way to get past all of these challenges where in the colonial mindset, our indigenous languages are not very valued. They're not considered very important. And I say that based on where the money's going, based on where the money is being spent. The money is being spent to study our languages, to document our languages. And we have to figure out a way to rethink this overinvestment on the kind of intellectual colonialism project itself, and instead learn to really value the knowledge of how to live in our specific landscapes, all of which is embedded and carried through our indigenous languages. And the expression we use at the kind of our saying at the Global Indigenous Languages Caucus, we talk about Okaju Tahe Okonfete. Together we can move it forward.
Nawanko, thank you so much, Richard, and thank you all the panelists for joining us today. And again, just really generously sharing all of your wisdom and your learnings and your experiences in this work. Before we come to a close, I just want to remind our attendees that please continue to utilize the swap card platform. There is a interactive tool and survey that we're inviting you all to participate in. And these recordings will be available on the platform as well, in addition to our YouTube and Facebook channels. So with that, I just want to again express my deepest gratitude to each one of our panelists, the entire cultural survival team for supporting in these efforts, as well as the interpreters in ensuring that this is an accessible event. Y'all won't go, y'all won't go, y'all won't go. Thank you so much. Wishing you all a great day. Please get some food, some water before our next session, and we will see you back in about, I think, 30 minutes. Thank you. Y'all won't go.